Welcome, Liberty Meers. I'll wait just a second. Let's see. I'll type in the chat window here. Okay. Let me just say then at the outset that good. Okay. Let me just say at the outset that any questions you have, I think I'm prepared to open up to look at them in the chat window, and we can discuss things if you'd like to. First of all, let me apologize for my bright red face. Concerned about vitamin D deficiency. I went outside in the sun today. I thought, well, maybe it's time to get a little bit of sun. You have to do that from time to time. It's good for your health. And then I was out there maybe 30, 45 minutes, something like that. And it was like being in an oven or something. It was just just insane. Just how much the sun just like instantaneously baked my face. I guess I hadn't been out enough or something, but it's just crazy. I mean, I look at myself going, oh my God, So I don't know. I think it was like 100 degrees out there or something today, but pretty insane. So I've got some hydrocortisone. I'll put it on, and I'm sure I'll be all fine in the morning. But for now, I'm a little bit toasted, a little bit disoriented. So Memorial Day weekend, right? Okay, so tonight we're talking about absolutely one of my favorite books in the history of the world, called Socialism, by Ludwig von Misess. And I would like to do it not just by talking about socialism alone, which I've done actually many times in the course of these seminars. Everybody knows that it's one of my favorite books. In fact, I think it's far more significant a work than people get a bit credit for being. One of the problems is that people typically regard this book as nothing but an attack on socialism. And so if you already disagree with socialism and you think it's terrible, there's no reason for you to read this book. What people don't understand is that actually, in fact, Mises offers a full-blown theory of politics and a full theory of social life and the organization of society within this book. And it's an extremely advanced theory. There's some points that he makes in the book that he never returns to again in his career. I have no idea why that is. I would say in some sense it's the most speculative, most, how do I put it? It's the book that he was a very young man when he wrote it. So he was very intense about all the newest scholarship, and he writes it with a level of passion that's actually quite extraordinary from the beginning to the end. As I say, I'm not sure why this is, but he offers a series of insights concerning social life, the family, the origin of property, the origin of the state, the nature and structure of human association, that for some reason he never really returns to. In fact, this book offers, I think, Mises's really only full-blown treatment of the topic of the origin of property that he does in any of his work. The rest of it, he just takes private property for granted, describing its utility, but never returns to this question about where it came from. And herein he also deals with the origin of the state and really wonderfully fundamental questions. I mean, there's a sense in which if he had never written anything other than this book, he also deals extensively with things like family, human sexuality, psychoanalysis and psychology, religion's basis. He has some very speculative thoughts about religious doctrine, about religious mysticism, syndicalism, intellectuals and socialism, just wonderful, sweeping stuff. It'll keep you busy for weeks, really, this book. I was about to say, if he had never written anything but this book, if it had been the culmination of his career, and he had gone on, and he had died or something, or retired, then it would have been enough to establish his name in the history of the social sciences. Of that, there's absolutely no question. In some sense, I think it's a kind of a tragedy that this book has been overshadowed by things like human action, because it's that level of book. I mean, the upshot of the book is that, of course, that it gives a a devastating, sweeping, all-encompassing case against socialism that you read and you never really recover from. Now, I'm assuming, most of us are not socialists. We think socialists are ridiculous and they're gone from the world today. So maybe that would make you think you don't need to read the book. But in Mises's day, almost everybody in academia was a socialist, at the University of Vienna. So he was really taking on the establishment in this big way. And he shocked many people. F.A. Hayek writes about what it was like for him, who was just basically a run-of-the-mill socialist like everybody else. And he read the book and he never quite recovered from it. He rejected socialism and never returned to it again. And it made a whole generation feel deeply uncomfortable, actually, with their preset ideological structures. And Mises had also made himself kind of through this book an enemy of a vast number of people. There were three main groups that he had become the enemy of. One was the professional philosopher class and the economists, the intellectuals, the academic elite in all over Europe, in the UK and the US. That was his primary target, of course, because he himself was an intellectual. Secondly, by taking on religion and the socialist mystics and the people who dream of creating a new world through fanciful imaginings of a spiritual nature, he took them on. Particularly, he took on early trends in Catholic and Protestant forms of socialism in the 1920s. So he made himself an enemy of the clerical class of the day. And then thirdly, he took on states and statesmen and politicians who, were fond of whipping up dreams of pure democracy, the abolition of private property and socialist revolution as a means of giving themselves power. Mises saw straight through this and took it on directly, and really showed that socialism was really just a kind of for this class of citizens, just a masquerade, a kind of just a pretext for dictatorship. So those are the three groups that he took on: the philosophers, the religious mystics, and the tyrants. And he did it in an all-encompassing way by laying out a full theory of society, the division of labor, the origin of property rights, the origin of the market economy, the workings of the market economy, the justification of the family, which of course every socialist at the time, was convinced that the family was an evil thing that had to be abolished, as Marx said in the Communist Manifesto. And this is very common. So he came to the defense of the family as an institution, and went into great depth on drawing mainly from the work of Freud, actually, in defense of gender roles as an extension of sexual biological realities, and then went on to attack every conceivable form of socialism, and just the book was amazing, and it blew people away. It was debated for something like 20 years. In particular, the thing that came under most intense debate after the book came out was his claim that socialism was unrealistic, literally, in the sense that it was inconsistent with the realities that were necessary for a civilized life. And his argument went like this. In order to have rational economic calculation, you had to have the ability to assess the opportunity costs of all the uses of resources. Whether some resource, whether steel or oil or paper or labor, should be used for this task or for that task. There's nothing about the nature of the world that really necessarily tells you whether or not that's true. The central planners don't automatically know, what the answer to that is. The answer is provided to us by the system of profit and loss, When things begin to lose money, when whole industries and sectors begin to lose money, that's a signal that that the resources are being incorrectly used. When they make money, it's a sign that they're being used right. But in order to calculate profit and loss, you have to have prices. Prices are a way of aggregating the prevailing realities concerning human values and relative scarcities of resources. But in order to have accurate prices, you had to have real life trading. You had to have people actually exchanging things, buying and selling things from each other in order to establish real existing prices. But you can't buy and sell, you can't trade in absence of private property. So that's the way his chain of logic ran. So in absence of private property, then you don't get accurate prices. In absence of accurate prices, you have nothing you can use to calculate profit and loss. Without profit and loss signals, you lack the ability to calculate rationally. And without the ability to calculate rationally, you're just randomly assigning resources, to whatever kind of based on political priorities or whatever, leading to total economic collapse, irrationality, and universal disaster. In fact, he predicts in here that under full-blown socialism, which he thinks is actually impossible, civilization would die out, very quickly. And any attempts to move towards socialism move us away from prosperity, rationality, efficiency towards inefficiency, statism, and decivilization. That's the way he argued. And it's quite a devastating challenge, because it said literally to the socialists, you can dream whatever you want. You can have all the high-flying theories you want, but in the end, you've got to figure out a way to make an economy actually function like an economy. And without private property, there is no economy. There's just none. You just have dictators randomly shuffling resources around. The socialists and the free market people debated this subject for essentially 25 years, between 1922 when this book came out and the late 1940s. And ironically, it was widely assumed within the literature that Mises had lost the debate in favor of the so-called market socialists, who imagined they could make up phony prices to substitute for this problem. Oscar Longa very famously said that he should erect a statue to Mises in Poland, because it was Mises that alerted the socialists to the key problem of economic calculation in a socialist commonwealth and led them to come up with a brilliant solution. Of course, the solution was not a solution, as Mises said in many of his later writings. And that seems very obvious to me when you read Mises's one chapter in here on economic calculation, that he makes a very decisive case. So that's the most famous part of the book. I don't think that it's all that's in this book. In this book, you'll find a complete social theory. As I've urged people on this program before, you'll be particularly interested in two chapters really that appear in the first third of the book. One is on the origin of property, where you get a theory of property rights that is not based in sort of Lockean homesteading and the idea of mixing your labor with things. That's just not part of Mises's theory of property at all. You get a completely different origin of property. Growing out of, he sees property as a kind of as an invention, a technology that was established in order to solve the problem of privation. And I think, I've thought about this quite a lot, that Mises is actually realistically and historically correct about this. I mean, Mises was very interested in this book and always grounding his theory in historical reality and facts about the world. I mean, his big problem with socialism is it seemed like a far-flung fantasy based on essentially nothing. Nothing realistic, nothing hard, nothing true. And he was always anxious in this book constantly to drive the readers back to the facts of reality, whether it's biological facts, certain physical facts about the scarcities in the world and the need for property to allocate resources, all kinds of historical experiences with socialism, all these things. He's constantly popping everybody's bubbles, right? I mean, this is what he's doing. He's blowing away fantasy and trying to ground your assessment of political and social realities in true functioning of the world, the way the world actually exists. So this is his sort of nonstop way that he argues from the beginning of the book all the way to the end. So what I'd like to do now is draw attention to a parallel, which I think is actually very close. And the parallel is with Aristotle's great book called Politics. And I don't know how many of you ever read it, but you can download it very quickly if you just Google Aristotle's Politics in EPUB. It'll come up for you very quickly. It's a mighty and interesting and brilliant book. If you think Aristotle's intimidating or scary and you don't know anything about it, forget all that. Just go to the internet, download the EPUB, spend an evening with it. You'll find it absolutely fascinating. It's a very clear writer, very clear thinker. But there's so many parallels between Aristotle's Politics and Misess's Socialism. They overlay each other very, very well. Let me caution you here that, I mean, Misess is obviously a much better thinker. You know, I mean, I don't know about thinker, but he was much more correct, right? So with Misess as a post-Enlightenment thinker, you know, living in the age of science, early 20th century, you know, advocate of universal human rights, universal enlightenment, democracy under the rule of law, an opponent of all forms of despotism, particularly slavery. So that was not, of course, true of Aristotle. Writing in the 4th century BC, this is a world of hierarchies, of state religions, of the subjugation of women, and of course, you know, pervasive slavery and what we would call despotism and tyranny. So that was Aristotle's world. Aristotle doesn't go nearly far enough in taking on these institutions. I mean, there was no notion of this idea of realizable universal human rights, much less universal freedom or liberalism, really, what we call liberalism, which I would sum up as being the insight that society can manage itself without top-down control. I mean, Aristotle was not in any sense a liberal. I mean, to understand this, he lived many, many years before there was an enlightened understanding of the case against slavery, the case for universal rights, free speech, freedom of religion. These were, none of this stuff was known in Aristotle's time. So when you take on Aristotle's Politics, you need to understand that, you know, or you won't make any sense out of his argument. So just put all your Enlightenment suppositions on the shelf and read it for what it is. So the downside, of course, of Aristotle is that he's a passionate defender of slavery. Thinks some people are born to be slaves, not so much out of biology, but just out of their station in life. There's a presumption throughout the book that women, you know, should be subjugated, that they belong to the whole community as birthing creatures, belong to their husbands as wives, belong to their fathers as daughters, and should never mix in politics under any circumstances. I mean, there's a greater degree of toleration for women in this book than for slaves, just simply because women are necessary for procreation. There's also, I mean, there's plenty of egregious things in Aristotle. He doesn't understand the first thing at all about money making and wealth. I mean, he ridicules the idea of making money. He doesn't essentially think it's possible to make money. He's especially down on usurers and bankers and people who exchange money for profit. I mean, he condemns this as inherently unjust. He thinks that a much better, like his conception of economics is essentially, I guess you could say, the opposite of Misess's in a way. He thinks that to grow wealthy is evidence that you've acquired wealth from somebody else. So for him, there's always a fixed pie. There's a certain amount of wealth in the world, and the only way to really get it is by taking it from somebody else. Acquisition, he calls it. Acquisition ends up being basically his case for war, which he loves war. He thinks that all children ought to be prepared for war. They should be prepared to be soldiers. And that soldiering is a very high profession. The purpose of a war is to go out and get wealth. There's no conception of what it meant to have a rise in economy. I mean, his conception of trading is funny. He sees it as just people moving stuff from here to there and back again. Just basically a pointless exercise. He condemns retail trade, by name, and has a very low regard for merchants. Who he thinks are, more or less very low figures. Artisans, he doesn't have any regard for them. No surprise, special pleader Aristotle was, as was all the philosophers of the time. He thought philosophy was the most important profession. I mean, philosophers are more important than statesmen, or freemen, or the aristocracy. It's certainly more important than the merchants and the retailers and the users. Way down at the bottom, the average merchants. Women occupy a very strange place because they're very high regard for women as in their biological function, very low regard for women as citizens and contributors to the social order. Children are essentially have no rights whatsoever. Education, in Aristotle's view, is obviously the job of the state. And then, of course, slavery. He can't even imagine a world without slavery. In fact, time and again in this book, he makes arguments against things like, should philosophers learn to be artisans too? Should we trade professions? Should statesmen also be farmers? Should people move around and change jobs and move amongst the castes? And his answer to that is no, that's ridiculous, because once we start that kind of thing, then we're going to lose all distinctions between the types of people in society, and eventually we could even lose the difference between master and slave. And if that happens, I mean, Aristotle just takes it as a given that that's the end of the end. Without slaves, nothing can work. So you might be thinking, well, what is it you like about this book then? I mean, what's so great about it? Well, there are many things that are great about it. I mean, one is his method, which is very much like Misess's. He's very interested in the facts of reality. He's super attached to the idea of the real world. He won't have anything to do with mystical dreams and abstract, free-floating concepts and forms and reflecting on what the heavens are saying to you or whatever. He was interested in logic and interested in reality, always. That's his method, and he never stops. I mean, from the beginning of the book to the end of the book, he's really focused on what is true around us. He never departs much from the realities of the real world, which is inspiring and great, and probably to that generation of intellectuals a blessed relief. The second great thing in the book is a thoroughgoing and beautiful and really in many ways inspired defense of, you guessed it, private property, just like Mises. So he's passionate about the subject. In fact, to me, this is the part of the book. There are many aspects of the book that are wonderful and egregious, but brilliant too. But this is probably the best part. His very powerful defense of property. Now, granted, his defense of property is compromised by the fact that he thinks that women, slaves, and children are themselves should be considered property. Okay, true. So he's confused and about what are the standards of what is and isn't property. Which, by the way, libertarians to this day are not entirely secure on that subject. What is and isn't property. So to some extent, I tend to, I think we should be somewhat forgiving of Aristotle in this respect, since most libertarians today don't even get this right, as far as I'm concerned. Um, I'm speaking to those in the know over the ongoing disputes concerning intellectual property. So we can't get that right. We still don't have a good conception of what is property. But nonetheless, he defends the idea of private ownership in a very beautiful way. So he starts by saying, in absence of private ownership, we can never refer to things like my child, my mother, my father, my sister, my brother. The whole conception of what is mine gets cut out completely. Under collective ownership, there's no such thing as mine. So there's no such thing as individuality in absence of ownership. So we wouldn't even have the word my in our language. And I feel sure, actually, by the way, that Ayn Rand, who quite frequently credited Aristotle with many of her views, took her position on ownership and individuality from Aristotle. I mean, I don't know this for sure, but he speaks very much in the vein that she's talked about. That in absence of private property, there's no sense of mine and yours, and I and you. The divisions between people, just gone completely. So there's that. Then he goes further to say that in absence of property, there can't be any such thing as giving to others. So if you don't own anything and nothing is really yours, you can't actually be benevolent to other people. You can't give them gifts. You can't take care of others. So in the absence of the physical possibility of being generous to other people, the generosity in spirit goes away completely. So benevolence is abolished, generosity of spirit is gone, and you reduce society to a sort of a very grueling state. I mean, this is Aristotle's prediction. And then he goes even further to say that in absence of private property, you won't have such things as love, since he says there's nothing that inspires a man or a person to love and care and to feel emotional attachments towards things like private ownership and privately owned things, private property. That this is what gives life to the human imagination. It's what gives us the desire to protect things and to care for them and to love them. So in absence of private property, Aristotle predicts there'll be a complete absence of love. So you could see here that there's a certain parallel in different forms, different times. I mean, these books are, essentially 2,300 years apart, right? But nonetheless, you have a kind of a parallel argument. Both of them very rooted in realities, both of them coming to the strong defense of private property, both predicting the calamitous results in absence of private property, and both taking on the enemies of private property in their day. So who were the enemies of private property in Aristotle's day? Well, basically it's the same people that Mises confronted. I mean, think about it, Aristotle's writing in the 4th century. So he's a student of Plato. Plato was an advocate of communism. Okay, now you can look at Plato's writings on collective ownership and communism and all the rest of it and say, oh, he was just being ironic. It's a reductio ad absurdum. He's just trying to get people to think yada, yada, whatever. It's clear that Aristotle thought that Plato was a defender of complete communism in property and in families. Oh, I forgot one thing about Aristotle. He's a passionate defender of the private ownership of land, which he names in particular, the land as being privately owned. So anyway, so he cites Plato, his teacher, throughout in opposition to him on this subject. So whether you think Plato was playing games, or not, it doesn't really matter. Aristotle takes him for being basically a communist, advocating communist ownership of property, communist ownership of wives and children, communist ownership of land, collective ownership, central plan, and dictatorship, top-down rule by philosopher kings, abolition of private life, which Plato saw was inconsistent with social harmony. So he thought that communism was the means towards social harmony. So it was Aristotle's burden of to demonstrate, actually, that as well-intentioned as Plato might be, his whole scheme here would actually lead to massive social division, the abolition of benevolence, generosity, a culture of giving, and a culture of love and concern and caretaking. So that's the first group that Aristotle's taken on, are the philosophers, namely Plato, his great teacher, and his influence. He was very interested in wiping out the influence that Plato had in a rising generation of, proto-socialist philosophers. The second group, and I tried to look this up a little bit, but I came up a little bit dry, so I can't really demonstrate this, but I'm just imagining the 4th century, in a religious sense, you had an official religion, the Roman religion, which nowadays is called paganism, but it was the official state religion, and it was stable, it was pious, they had their gods, there's a god for everything, there are temples all over the place, and everybody was required to worship it. And Aristotle himself was an advocate of pious adherence to this state religion. But, in this period, and I'm basing this partly on, what I know about religious history, but as in any period, there had to have been religious crazies running around all over the place, advocating every kind of mystical dream. I know for sure that 8 centuries later, there was madness all over the land. In fact, I'm quite certain that there's no period in history where there hasn't been religious madness of some sort loose on the land. So it had to be true in 4th century Greece too. People advocating communism as a form of spiritual purification. So there's a sense in which he was taking on, the religious mystics, the same as Misess did in the 1920s. And there's a third group, namely the would-be tyrants and statesmen, which are always threatening, and in politics at all times, but particularly in Aristotle's time, there's always despotism on the loose. So he hammers this point. So what do the despots want? Well, they want to abolish private property, not because they want to bring about universal peace, but because they want to put themselves in power. He warns specifically against sort of radically democratic ideas, because he thinks that would lead to a massive social chaos and massive theft of property. He warns against revolution because he says that quite often revolutions are fomented not really for the overthrow of despotism, but for the replacement of one form of injudicious, unjust leadership in favor of a kind of a dictatorship. That's what he thinks is always the result, or more or less often the result of revolution. So he's warning constantly about tyranny. In fact, if Aristotle believes that he has one theory in the book, it was an anti-tyranny book. How do you achieve a stable social order without tyranny? So he's taking them on directly and defending private property as a tool against the rise of tyranny. We don't need to go into what he calls tyranny. I mean, I think most of us would regard what Aristotle considered the ideal government as being a form of tyranny. Certainly, I think I would. But what he means by tyranny is really just a kind of a centralized system of one-man rule, where the law is entirely arbitrary, where the free men and the aristocracy do not have access to having any influence over the form of law in society. That would be for Aristotle tyranny. So you see what I'm driving at here. Oh, and by the way, Aristotle has some amazing comments in here that are just quite extraordinary. He says, what if the greater numbers of poor people, which are always greater than the number of rich, gather together to pillage all the property of the rich. Would that be just? And he has this comment. He says, if that is not injustice, it's hard to know what is. Nice, right? Then he goes further and said it would be equally unjust for the rich to gather all of their resources and all of their powers and pillage all of the poor. So that would be similarly unjust. So it's a very interesting to follow his thinking here, because he's like getting close to a universalist understanding of property. I mean, he doesn't go all the way, obviously, but you can see where he's driving with this whole thing. So you can see now why I would like to make these parallels between Aristotle's politics and Mises's socialism. I mean, both of them were very strong defenders of private property. They saw that as a central institution that makes the social order work, probably the most central one, without which everything else falls apart. All human virtue, everything is destroyed. And in Aristotle's case, it's virtue, affection, love, benevolence. Even our vocabulary, our sense of ourselves is smashed in the absence of private property. For Mises, absence of private property means economic chaos, the end of efficiency, the end of economic rationality, and certainly the end of economic growth. Aristotle did not make that kind of argument because he didn't understand that economic growth is even possible, so he couldn't make that kind of argument. Nonetheless, both of them very passionate defenders of private property. However flawed Aristotle was in his understanding, at least he got that much right. And look who they were confronting. Both were confronting the same three groups of opponents of property in their time. On one hand, the academic elite. Secondly, the religious mystics and the clerical class, who imagine communism as a means towards spiritual salvation. It's true in Aristotle's time, it's true in Mises's time. And thirdly, would-be tyrants who don't like private property, who like to get rid of it as a means for acquiring more power. So it's very interesting to me to read the two parallel, because the same problems are confronting both, and they both have the same kind of answer, and they're both centered on property as the ideal solution. In our own times, of course, remains true. I mean, who are the great opponents of private property in our time? It's still the academic elite, the religious mystics, and those who think that we're going to achieve some sort of greater virtuous state by taxing everybody or by sharing everything in common. And thirdly, always and everywhere, the tyrants who basically rail against private property as a means of gaining power and keeping power and becoming despots. Same group in Aristotle's time, Mises' time, and our time. It never changes, always the same. What's different slightly is the nature of argumentation that Mises used, that Aristotle used. And then in our own time, we have to use different types of arguments, I would say, than Mises himself did. What else to say about Mises's book? I think it repays a very close reading now. Let me just say something about Mises's own defense of property, because if he's going to make private property the central point of his book, he's got to have a good basis for it. So he talks about private property as being a technology, that it comes about to solve a particular social problem, mainly the appearance of privation. There's just not enough to go around. So people have to figure out a way to make more stuff. And the only way you can really do that is through things like domestication of animals and through raising crops. But both of which require a sense of what is mine. So you have to stake out a certain amount of land and secure it against invaders. And if you're successful in doing that, then you can seek out a community consensus that this is private. This is mine. you respect what I'm calling my private property rights. I'll respect what you call your private property rights. And it's the same thing, domestication of animals. These are my goats. I'm going to make them my goats. I'm going to call them my goats. You don't get anywhere near them. If you do, I'm going to do something bad to you. But if you do trespass, then I'm gonna use all my powers to stop you. But if you don't, then I'll in turn respect your private property rights. So gradually over time, there emerges, just out of social utility, out of social necessity, a technology which we can call private property, which is really just a social consensus. This is a very important theory, and it's different from, I would say, two other perspectives. One is the sort of heavenly theory of property that, Moses delivered the tablets and said, "Thou shalt not steal," and that established property rights. That property rights is somehow granted to us by the gods or by natural law, written on our hearts or something like that. Mises would say, no, it's just something we came up with to make the world work better. The other theory of property, of course, that this contradicts in a way is Locke's own theory, which is an interesting perspective that says if you mix your labor somehow with a body of land or with items around you, then that somehow establishes the rights to own them. I mean, the problem I have with this Lockean theory is that it always seems to, there's plenty of problems with it. One of them is that it presumes some sort of third party, a judge that's already in place that can implement the theory and say, yes, that is just ownership. You can keep that because you mixed your labor with it, I mean, he sets up the standard, but the problem is the world doesn't really have such a third party neutral observer to say, oh, you've mixed your labor with it, therefore it's yours. I mean, that's just that works fine in theory, but the reality is that if your property rights are not respected in real time, you don't have them. I mean, as just a contemporary example that I like to give, if you leave your wallet on the trunk of your car and come back at the end of the day and it's gone, in what sense is that wallet really yours? I mean, you can say, well, you took my wallet. Well, that's just your perspective. But if you're unable to secure it, and there's not a social consensus that says, I'm going to leave that alone and let him have it, you basically don't have private property rights. I mean, you can claim you do, but they're not real. So the other problem with Locke's theory is this idea of labor being the source of the generation of the existence of private property rights, which gets you into many other problems which still persist today in the theory of property, because it's not clear whether labor has anything to do with anything. If I claim a gigantic rock in front of me as my own, whether I turn that into a sculpture or not, essentially has nothing to do with whether or not my property rights in that rock are real, are realizable, enforceable, and can act upon them. I mean, it just essentially has nothing. It seems to me the whole labor aspect of Locke's theory is just a gigantic distraction. So if you're looking for an alternative theory of the origin of property to both Locke and to sort of, heaven came down and filled the world with property, the sort of theistic understandings of property rights, you might have a look at this chapter. And again, as I say, it's a brilliant chapter. I've never read anything like it. And Mises never revisits it again in the whole of his work, and I don't really know why. What's interesting too, and I'll say just one last point about this, the socialists were very fond of claiming that violence was always the origin of property, that there wouldn't be property in the absence of violence. Mises very strangely just grants this. Goes, yeah, that's right. That's just the way it is. If in a world of growing privation, I find a plot of land that nobody's using, and I turn it into a nice farm, and I'm invested in this thing in some sense, and I want it to be mine. Plenty of people are going to try to take it from me. I'm going to use violence in order to protect what I'm calling mine and to prevent you from calling it yours. So in that sense, Mises says that the socialists like Proudhon and others are perfectly correct. Violence is an inherent part of the establishment of property rights. Now, we might clarify and say with the threat of violence, okay, maybe not actual violence, but threat of violence, actual violence, whatever. Basically, you have to be able to defend what's yours if you want it to be yours. And if you can't defend it, it's not going to be yours for very long. I like this theory that Mises has here of property rights because, first of all, it's been verified time and again by anthropologists who have said this is basically the story of the history of civilization, that we lived in an age of more or less plenty because the population was small, that they could get by with grazing and eating, slow-moving animals and that sort of thing. But as the human population grew, privation appeared, and that was the origin of property. So anthropologists have pretty well established this. The second thing is that it seems consistent with the way I understand history too. Property rights in the modern sense don't really exist in any kind of universal sense until something like the late Middle Ages, at the time when people developed the technology to defend their rights. I mean, if you were a peasant living on let's change the example a little bit. If you're the 14th century, say, okay, so feudalism is beginning to collapse, and you've moved off to your own plot of land, and you're a merchant more or less. You know better than to travel alone. I mean, you might have property rights in your homestead and in the immediate area you're around, or within your community that recognizes your private property rights. But as soon as you hit the road and start traveling, you're definitely going to get mugged, you're going to get killed, you're going to get robbed. I mean, there's no recognition of property rights out of the homestead. This is why people would always travel in packs, always travel with as many defensive weapons as they could around them, and it was only gradually over the time, with the rise of prosperity, that universal property rights came to be recognized as a kind of a moral postulate, as something that was realizable and something we could actually act on. So this is why I like Mises's theory. It seems to me that much better than Locke, much better than religious revelation, actually seems to account for the real history of the development of civilization. I think it's very powerful. So one final comment on his section about the family. Mises has to go to great lengths to defend the family against the communists of his time, who were very interested, who blamed the existence of the family for the oppression of women, and in turn blamed private property rights and a sense of private life for the existence of the oppression of women. And Mises makes a very interesting argument, but rooted in Freudian psychology, in favor of the capacity of men and women to cooperate in the division of labor within the household. Women have certain biological gifts that men do not have. They're childbearing. That comes to heavily inform the choices that they make in life, and to live in a family unit is most advantageous for women, and for most men, it's advantageous for them as well. Mises also has his very interesting remarks. He's writing long before he got married, but he says there's certain geniuses in the world that should never get married. They should just always live without a spouse, do their own thing. The philosopher, basically Mises' view of the philosopher kings. So anyway, if you want to read something that's fascinating and harrowing and well, I should say further that this is the chapter in which Mises reveals himself as a thoroughgoing 1920s style feminist, right? So he tells the history of women as one long period of subjugation, and which, to return to Aristotle again, certainly that was the classical world, right? And until the age of capitalism, where conquest is replaced by the idea of contract, and marriage becomes a contract instead of just the stronger, more powerful men, taking what they want and holding women in subjugation. So this is Mises's theory. It's a really interesting. I don't know. I guess that you would call it the latter period of first wave feminism, right? That Mises is writing in. So he upholds capitalism as being the great tool of women's liberation. And he does it with tremendous passion and power. It's a very, very beautiful section. So I'll leave it there and say, to return to my first theme, don't believe that just because you're not a socialist that this book has nothing to offer you. It's incredibly compelling. On every page you'll find some amazing insight. Many of his insights in this book are not repeated in his later work. I think it's one of his most mature, dazzling, intellectually engaging, fascinating books that he ever wrote, and really shows what an amazing thinker he was. A thinker on the level of an Aristotle. Both of them very anxious to ground their theories of the world in reality instead of just far-flung abstractions. Both of them passionate defenders of private property rights. Both of them essentially arguing against one or another form of tyranny and seeing private property and private life as being an important bulwark against central control of society, tyranny, and a foundation for living a full and flourishing good life. So, well, thank you very much for listening. If there's no questions, I'll leave it there. You can download Socialism by Ludwig von Misess, again, written in 1922 from liberty.me. It's a beautiful edition. Enjoy yourselves. And while you're doing it, grab Aristotle's Politics, dip into it, and enjoy it, because it is a fabulous treatise. Both of them are wonderful testaments to what it means for great minds to engage the great political, social, and certainly in Mises' case, economic questions of our day. All the best to you, and take care. I look forward to seeing you next week. All the best. So I don't know. I think it was like 100 degrees out there or something today, but pretty insane. So I've got some hydrocortisone. I'll put it on, and I'm sure I'll be all fine in the morning. But for now, I'm a little bit toasted, a little bit disoriented. So Memorial Day weekend, right? Okay, so tonight we're talking about absolutely one of my favorite books in the history of the world, called Socialism by Ludwig von Misess. And I would like to do it not just by talking about socialism alone, which I've done actually many times in the course of these seminars. Everybody knows that it's one of my favorite books. In fact, I think it's far more significant a work than people get a bit credit for being. One of the problems is that people typically regard this book as nothing but an attack on socialism. And so if you already disagree with socialism and you think it's terrible, there's no reason for you to read this book. What people don't understand is that actually, in fact, Mises offers a full-blown theory of politics and a full theory of social life and the organization of society within this book. And it's an extremely advanced theory. There's some points and really wonderfully fundamental questions. I mean, there's a sense in which if he had never written anything other than this book, he also deals extensively with things like family, human sexuality, psychoanalysis and psychology, religion's basis. He has some very speculative thoughts about religious doctrine, about religious mysticism, syndicalism, intellectuals and socialism, just wonderful, sweeping stuff. It'll keep you busy for weeks, really, this book. I was about to say, if he had never written anything but this book, if it had been the culmination of his career, and he had gone on, and he had died or something, or retired, then it would have been enough to establish his name in the history of the social sciences. Of that, there's absolutely no question. In some sense, I think it's a kind of a tragedy that this book has been overshadowed by things like Human Action, because it's that level of book. I mean, the upshot of the book is that, of course, that it gives a devastating, sweeping, all-encompassing that he makes in the book that he never returns to again in his career. I have no idea why that is. I would say in some sense it's his most speculative, most, how do I put it? It's the book that he was a very young man when he wrote it. So he was very intense about all the newest scholarship, and he writes it with a level of passion that's actually quite extraordinary. From the beginning to the end. As I say, I'm not sure why this is, but he offers a series of insights concerning social life, the family, the origin of property, the origin of the state, the nature and structure of human association, that for some reason he never really returns to. In fact, this book offers, I think, Mises's really only full-blown treatment of the topic of the origin of property that he does in any of his work. The rest of it, he just takes private property for granted, describing its utility, but never returns to this question about where it came from. And herein he also deals with the origin of the state. And welcome, Liberty Mears. I'll wait just a second. Let's see, I'll type in the chat window here. Okay. Let me just say then at the outset that, good, okay. Let me just say at the outset that any questions you have, I think I'm prepared to open up to look at them in the chat window, and we can discuss things if you'd like to. First of all, let me apologize for my bright red face. Concerned about vitamin D deficiency. I went outside in the sun today. I thought, well, maybe it's time to get a little bit of sun, I mean, you have to do that from time to time. It's good for your health. And then I was out there maybe, 30, 45 minutes, something like that. And it was like, being in an oven or something. It was just, it's just insane, just how much the sun just like instantaneously baked my face. I guess I hadn't been out enough or something, but it's just crazy. I mean, I look at myself going, oh my God, case against socialism that you read and you never really recover from. Now, I'm assuming, most of us are not socialists. We think socialists are ridiculous and they're gone from the world today. So maybe that would make you think you don't need to read the book. But in Mises's day, almost everybody in academia was a socialist, at the University of Vienna. So he was really taking on the establishment in this big way. And he shocked many people. F.A. Hayek writes about what it was like for him, who was just basically a run-of-the-mill socialist like everybody else. And he read the book and he never quite recovered from it. rejected socialism and never returned to it again. And it made a whole generation feel deeply uncomfortable, actually, with their preset ideological structures. And Mises had also made himself kind of through this book an enemy of a vast number of people. There were three main groups that he had become the enemy of. One was the professional philosopher class and the economists, the intellectuals, the academic elite.